Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Casatella. I'm a senior research fellow here at Miser and the convener of the Wednesday seminar and the cycle of lecture on global lectures. Many of you know me in the room, but there are some new faces and some new people in the virtual room. So just as a reminder, the global lectures were established during COVID time, and they were a way to have scholars of global relevance present at Miser using the possibility offered by online virtuality. And so thanks to a committee established at Miser last year and to the work of our postdoctoral fellows, the global conversation have been re-established. And particularly in the last three, I have to thank the effort of Dr. Gianberrier, who has been essential to the possibility of really following up and having these events. So today we have the privilege and pleasure to have with us Professor Silvia Federici. And we are very grateful to the fact that you can dedicate this time to us, particularly because in New York it's 7 o'clock in the morning. Thank you very much. Professor Federici is Professor Emerita at Hofstra University in the United States. She received her BA from the University of Bologna. I'm just mentioning this because it's also my alma mater. And a PhD from SUNY at Buffalo in the United States. She doesn't need much presentation, but let me say a couple of words. She's an internationally acclaimed feminist scholar and activist renowned for her work in Marxist feminist theory, the history of women, and the politics of the common. She's a truly public intellectual. Her most influential work that we read in different classes here at Miser is Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, a landmark work that addresses the question of primitive accumulation, Marxist theory, pointing particular to the aspect of colonized people, the Caliban, and the Witch, the subjugated women. Among other works of notable mention are Wages Against Housework, which was an earlier work, Revolution 0.0, Household, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle. Professor Federici is also an activist. Since the 1960s, she's been one of the main figures behind international debates on the condition of remuneration of domestic work, which has led to the foundation of a collective, international feminist collective in the 70s. She was also part of co-founder of a committee of academic freedom in Africa, resulting from her engagement with African University, particularly in Nigeria, and is also participating in numerous other activist network. The focus of today's presentation is the way in which popular feminist movement across the world respond or are implicated in the crisis of our time, particularly social, political, economic, and ecological crisis, and what particularly effect these have on the question of social reproduction. So we will proceed as usual as follows. So the presenter will have the time required to offer the lecture, and then we will go in this order. We will have Ruth Kitamirike, who is a third-year PhD fellow here at Miser, and then we will have Dr. Mohamed Luniago, who is a postdoc here at Miser. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Professor Federici. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you. Greetings to you all. And I'm very happy to be with you today and to discuss these issues that are so important. I have titled my presentation, The War Against Social Reproduction and Women's Movements' Responses to it across the world. And the reason I've spoken of a war against reproduction is because, in fact, I don't think there is any other way in which we can characterize, the many policies, economic and otherwise, that have been implemented, which are destroying people's life, not only by warfare, but by policies that are affecting their everyday life. And well, the most critical example, extreme, that we see of this war, of course, is the situation in Palestine. But as I've written in one of the articles that I've published on the issue, Palestine is the world, because since at least the late 70s, internationally, a whole attack has been waged, through the institution of a globally, artificially created debt crisis. A whole policy has been implemented under the name of structural adjustment, managed by the World Bank and the IMF, and I'm sure that all of you are very, very familiar with it, that has affected and undermined, every aspect of the reproduction of day-to-day life, across the world, but in particular, in the countries that were in the 70s, coming out of an anti-colonial struggle, and they were engaged in a process of reconstruction, certainly countries of Africa, among others. And in fact, the policy of structural adjustment has been a policy of recolonization, because in a way, at institution conditions of living that in some cases have been considered even worse than those that prevailed during the colonial period, in the sense that they have completely devalued local currencies. They have forced governments to apply austerity policies, that have cut investment, in all forms, in education, healthcare, public transport, support for basic necessities. They have forced government to, in the name of comparative advantage, to dismantle whatever industrial or manufacturing outfits they had, and instead open the door not only to imports from abroad, but also, to all kinds of extractivist companies, which have basically now for years and years and years sacked continents, oil, drilling, mining, and of course also agribusiness. And these processes, we know, have displaced, millions of people and forced them on their way to migration. And it's very cruel and ironic, that the persecution of migrants that is now taking place in the United States and that is taking place in Europe, is actually treating migrants as invaders, when in fact it has been the very policies of the US, International Monetary Fund, the European Community, that have forced people on the way of what is in fact is a form of exile. And in fact, we can judge the severity, of the programs that have been forced upon country by the fact that for the first time historically, it has been also, we have seen massive forms of migration by women. Usually women are not the ones who migrate. Usually it has been the men. Traditionally, the men have taken, the road to abroad, but women have stayed home with the children, the elderly. But the severity of the attack on the condition of social reproduction has been such that for the first time there have been a massive number of women, from Asia, from Africa, from the Caribbean island, Latin America, going to the so-called developed countries, because in the areas of, in their own countries, they had no possibility of guaranteeing a future to their community, to their children, to their communities. So this is, and of course, these processes have been accompanied by extreme level of violence. We see now that for years, of course, today the war is on the agenda, across the world, beginning with the war of the United States against Iran, and the many mini wars that the United States is now waging, against the people throughout Latin America, but also, we have, since the 1980s, we have had a state in which war of different types, has been a constant part, of political life. Let's remember the war on drugs, the war on terrorism. In other words, multiple levels of violence have been deployed necessary to support policies that are directly affecting people's life and therefore have created massive forms of resistance. Through the 80s and 90s, I've often documented, for example, since I spent time in Nigeria, I've documented the strike, the protest movement that have developed, particularly in Africa, but not exclusively in Africa, against structural adjustment and the very violent ways in which they have repressed. And I've also followed the struggle that people have made, especially again in Nigeria, but not exclusively, against the devastation produced by the oil companies, for example. For instance, the big attack and war the Shell conducted in the 90s against the Ogoni people in Nigeria. But what I wanted to talk today was something different, which is the rise, of in many parts of the world, and particularly this is going to be the focus of my presentation in Latin America, of new forms of feminism, new popular grassroots-rooted feminist movements that have not only fought, against these policies, but in the process of the struggle have also begun to lay what I would say the foundation, of new social relation, of a new society. And these are feminist movements that have not been particularly or exclusively concerned with the question of equality. In fact, they're very suspicious of the struggle of equality, wondering, equality with whom? Since in this community, men too have been persecuted, but have been concerned instead with creating an alternative and recuperating the control on the means of the reproduction of their lives. And this is what I'm going to concentrate upon. But I also want to first add that it is very important to think about the question of what is the kind of struggle that we need to organize today, the quality, the goals, the forms of organization, because the war against social reproduction I'm speaking about, it's not, it's something that is very systemic. It reveals to us an extremely systemic problem. In other words, it is not against occasional situation. It's a war that stems from the very nature of capitalist development, historically and in our time. Certainly, this major attack, that's been unfolding since the 1970s. I mean, capitalism has always been violent. Capitalism has always been destructive. But certainly, since the 1970s, we have seen a new round, that under the name of globalization, neoliberalism, we have seen a new expansion of capitalist relation that has responded. We have to understand it has been a response, to the fact that the movement of the 60s, beginning with the anti-colonial struggle, has in a sense undermined, the foundation, has challenged the foundation of capitalism and coloniality, worldwide. And so it's not accidental that, by the mid-70s, we see this response. It's a response that, in a sense, tries to change and in a sense, more severely, try to change the forms of the development itself, and does so in the form of a massive, massive expansion of capitalist relation, privatization, displacement, forms of attack that are reminiscent of what Marx called primitive accumulation. Yeah, to recuperate, right? To recuperate, adequate forms of profit, adequate forms of accumulation. And clearly that and the creation of an artificial debt crisis, and we can talk about that in the discussion period, has been an important instrument of this restructuring of development, of this restructuring of social relation and social reproduction. So I think that there's an understanding in these movements that what we are confronting is not something episodic, but it is something that is very deeply embedded in the logic of capitalist development, that we're never challenged, we're never unable to reach, the adequate required levels of profit, required level of accumulation, resorts to forms of welfare, massive, again, expropriation and major cuts in the resources devoted to reproduction, with the consequence of massive impoverishment, right? And of course the extremization of repressive methods. And all over the world, not only we see now warfare as a component of daily life, but the process of militarization, the growth of system of surveillance, right, that is now becoming an intrinsic element, of everyday life. Now, the movement I'm speaking about have particularly been involved in a struggle, in a crucial area of social reproduction. First, the struggle against that. The struggle against that. Also, the struggle to reclaim land, and to assert, the need for establishing forms of food sovereignty. The struggle also, of course, against the forms of violence that have accompanied these policies, and the struggle also to maintain the collective memory, of the community, and to reorganize community life around more cooperative forms of reproduction, breaking down the walls, the forms of isolation in which so often, women have been forced to carry on their domestic activity. So this is some of the issues that I like to discuss to show, which is my goal, that not in the struggle that are now being organized and carried out, by popular grassroots movements, and are not only fighting, against the war of reproduction, but they're also creating new kind of social relation, in this process laying the foundation for a new type of society. One important example, for instance, coming from Latin America, from as well as from part of the United States, like Puerto Rico, the struggle against that. The struggle against that is something that has been growing now for many, many years. and has seen the creation of international network. They go from Africa to Latin America, also through Europe, but has taken a particularly important forms in countries like Argentina, where the movement like Ni Una Menos, has organized massive forms of resistance, but against that with demonstration that have brought to the street, thousands and thousands of women. But at the same time, have also begun a process that in a way, changes the terms of the relationship, with the government and with international capital, not only by demanding, for example, audits, for the debts that are being imputed to the country, and denouncing the fact, which is something so many movements have done, denouncing the fact that the debts have been taken by oppressive government without any popular participation in the decision-making process, but rather that, in fact, it is the government that is in debt. It is international capital that is in debt to women. In other words, they have waged forms of organizing that have completely reversed the term, of the struggle, showing that, under the question of who owes to who is the debtor, and who is in debt, and showing that, in fact, for generation, government in Latin America as well as across the world, we can say, have taken advantage, exploited, women's unpaid labor, that for generation, women have actually done all the work, of reproducing, the workforce, of raising the children, of day-to-day organizing the housework and the reproduction process, and so actually challenging the state, in fact, to a process of reparation, similar to the process of reparation that is owed, to African countries and to all the countries, from which people have been taken in slavery. So, it's been important in this transformation, of the struggle into a struggle that puts the state, in the position of being the one who is seen. And of course, there has been at the same time, a large number, and this not only in Argentina, but for example, we are seeing also in the Caribbean countries and in Puerto Rico, of strike against banks that have been complicitous, with this basically process of forcing people. And the women in Argentina have spoken about financial extractivism, that in fact, what the debt is about is a form of extractivism similar to the extractivism of oil companies, because it's taking away, is robbing, people's energies, people's life, people's future. So this is an example, again, of a struggle that in a way creates, not only resist, not only says no, not only protest, but at the same time also opens up another ground, opens up another terrain on which people can come together and transform the condition of understanding what is the world in which we live in, what is really the nature of the debt, who's really the debtor in this society. At the same time, and again, here I think we are speaking of an international phenomenon. One of the major struggles of this new what I call feminist insurgency, a feminist insurgency that has developed particularly in response, to the war, structural adjustment, and all the forms of violence, economic, political, and physical that have accompanied these policies. One common element has been the struggle for the reclamation of land, which is not to be confused with the struggle for land rights, which is an important struggle, but too often has been manipulated by, for example, institutions like the United Nations, because land rights becomes, another struggle that asserts property rights, whereas the struggle to reclaim land is a struggle that put back the land that has been taken away, in the hands of community, in the hands, of a collectivity, and in the recognition that unless you are able to control the land, unless you have access to land, which is something that is becoming more and more difficult as more and more people are displaced from their ancestral land, unless you do that, you cannot control your life. You cannot control your life. For some years now, the United Nations has been celebrating the fact that comes 2050, say, most of the world population will be living in an urban environment. And they have celebrated that, and they've seen it as a sign of progress, as presumably life in the city offers so many more possibilities than life in the rural area. And I think we have to resist and denounce this position, because in fact, what is happening is like a massive worldwide vacuum cleaner, right? Policies that in fact are pulling people away, displacing people from the land. And because it's very clear that once you have lost all contact with the land, and all contact also with forms of agriculture that are not directed towards the market, but they are directed towards subsistence. Once you've lost that, you have no control over your life. You have no control over the food that we eat. You have no control over the water that we drink. You have not access, for example, to the forest, to the trees, to the coastal line, where you can survive. For example, has thousands and thousands of small communities have done historically from fishing. So the struggle for the land is a struggle for life, is a struggle for control over one's life. And I think that this is a struggle that is perhaps the most powerful, the most important, and the most bloodied that is taking place today across the world. And it has so many, many different forms. In Latin America, one of the most, egregious example has been the struggle of movements like the MST, the Landless Movement of Brazil, that for years, have organized and been able to reclaim thousands and thousands of acres of land and create communities that now have almost forms of self-government, because once you have access to land, then you can organize your forms of reproduction upon it in a more self-determined way. Right? But, another important development that has taken place over the last few decades, from Africa to Asia through Latin America, has also been the phenomenon of urban farming that has been led by women. Urban farming means that even when people have been displaced from their land and have been forced to urbanize, when they've been forced to go to the cities with nothing in their hands, right? That instead of accepting the defeat, instead of accepting, to survive, by submitting to any work, any kind of work condition imposed, right? They have also begun to reclaim, recuperate, land not used in an urban context. And in fact, there's been many studies of this phenomenon, which has been strong, particularly in many parts of Africa, from the Congo to South Africa, called urbanization. Urbanization. I'll be very interested in the discussion to know to what extent that is also present in Kenya. I assume that it is. Urbanization. And we have seen that this has spilled over also in Europe, has spilled over into the United States, where, under the impact of immigrant community, under the impact of the action activities of immigrants, who have brought with themselves, to the US, for instance, the need for land. They have created communal garden. They have created, so many parts of the US now have communal gardens, which are areas of collaboration, cultural exchange, very, very important places where people, in a sense, are saying no to the fact of being displaced, of being treated like renters on this land, right? That you don't have the right to a piece of land on which you put your feet, land that you can claim your own. So the reclaiming of land has also meant, for a struggle against, the devastating policies of, oil companies and mining companies. So all throughout Latin America, over the last decades, we have seen the growth, of movement, particularly led by indigenous women, that have fought to force companies to leave the oil in the ground, to leave the oil in the ground. And in particularly strong, the struggle has been in the Ecuadorian Amazonia, where women have organized marches to the capital, have organized a struggle with the oil companies to basically insist that oil operation has to cease, because they're poisoning the earth, they're poisoning the waters, and they're poisoning the life of people, and the spreading of diseases, and the making impossible of people to have access to food sources, because of the devastation caused by oil company, has been at the center of the struggle. And we have seen the struggle also in the United States, where, for example, again, led by women, where in North Dakota, in the year 2000, from February 2016 to April 2017, a massive occupation, of an area where a pipeline, an oil pipeline, was supposed to be constructed, which unfortunately eventually was. But there was a year of occupation of thousands of people, with women organizing the life of thousands of people, organizing even schooling for the children, organizing the food distribution, organizing the management of everyday relationship. Eventually, the struggle was defeated, the pipeline was constructed, but nevertheless, the struggle have continued. So this is a very extremely important, because the idea that women are the ones who are paying the worst price, for these policies. They are the ones being the primary subject, of the day-to-day reproduction of their community. They are the ones who are paying the largest price. When the local supplies of water, are polluted, they have to walk miles and miles and miles to go and fetch water that is not poisoning their family. When the land is polluted, then they have to deal with all the diseases on the Chikpo movement in India. It's a movement very powerful that was organized to have women, was a women's movement, women to hug the trees when the loggers would come to cut them, right? And they would put their body, wrapping their body around the trees in order to stop the loggers. And she has written in this book called Staying Alive, something very powerful pages showing how forests are a whole reproductive system. A forest is a full reproductive system because in it you find almost everything. You find fruits, you find roots, you find medical herbs, you find also the quiet and silence that is enhancing the possibility of a spiritual contact with nature, which is also what is now more and more being deprived, in this enforced urbanization, that, we are all facing, right? So this struggle is taking on, and certainly in places like Brazil, it's been extremely spread, and in the process, women have realized, and there's a whole documentation around it, women have realized both the important connection between, the health of the land and the health of the body. In fact, throughout this struggle and throughout Latin America, the notion of a body territory has developed. What happens to the body is what happens to the land and vice versa. You cannot separate our bodies, our life from the land. No? And so that the fact the feminist movement has to be an ecological movement, that you cannot have, a good, healthy life, and you cannot have a good, healthy life for your community unless you also struggle. The feminist movement cannot be concerned with women without being concerned with the natural world. In the same way, it has to be concerned with racism, with coloniality, with capitalism. And also that you cannot have, a struggle against to reclaim land and against, the devastation of international capital and international corporation without at the same fighting, patriarchal relation. Because over and over and over, their own struggle has been hampered by the fact that, for example, men in their community, men, particularly younger men who had no future, who saw no future, no jobs, would be attracted by the miserable money offered by the oil companies. And more than that, not only that, but that patriarchal relation, the fact of having to fight, against, the many forms of male supremacy in everyday life, sapped their energy. And they have been saying over and over that they cannot fight the oil company, they cannot fight, and against that and so on. Once their energies are taken away in the daily struggle they have to do, because of the many ways in which men are limiting their action. Men are trying to dominate what they do. And so this question of a feminist movement, the relationship between anti-patriarchal struggle and the struggle against, ecological devastation, the struggle for reclaiming the land, how they are inseparable, or the struggle for control of our bodies and the health of our bodies, and the struggle against, corporate destruction of our life. That this is fundamental issues and at the same time, another important development that I want to talk about, it's also the fact that more and more in the course of the last decades, we have seen movements, feminist movements, that have recognized that we cannot have struggle that are sustained, struggle that are not episodic, but that in fact are growing and creating different world, different relation, unless we begin to reorganize the process of reproduction itself, and particularly to break down, the many ways in which capitalism has organized the reproduction of our life, which has isolated women, has isolated people. It has been said that capitalism historically has brought together people in the factories, but always, has been quite careful to separate people, in the process of the production of life. So the nuclear family, imposing the nuclear family, imposing relation of privacy, right? Creating walls, literally creating walls between different families, different women, breaking down communitarian, destroying the commons, right? And the whole process of privatization. There's been privatization of land, privatization of resources, but there's been also privatization of bodies, privatization of lives. And this has been really part of a policy of defeat, because the moment that you are separate from other people, as we know, right, and you're confronting your crisis alone, you're already defeated. And so it's not accidental that in this process, in this very moment, so crucial, moments in which masses and masses of people, and particularly a lot of women, which I repeat are the main subject of reproductive life, of the reproduction of life, have confronted, this very, very destructive policy. They need to, in fact, reestablish, recuperate form of cooperation, right? Not only in the struggle, not only in the moment of the struggle, which of course, but also in the moment of the everyday life, the everyday reproduction of life, right? So that, for example, a very strong example, is what has happened, in many, well, I'll take the case of Argentina, in what they call villas miserias, misery villas, misery towns. Misery town are the encampments, or the large communities. Now they are small towns that have developed at the peripheries of the big metropolis like Buenos Aires. These are areas where people who were expelled from the rural areas, have been forced. They have gone there, they have taken over land not used at the periphery of towns. And with their collective labor, they have begun to construct, new life, houses, streets. I visited a number of them, Villa 31, Villa 24, where women with pride would tell me, we did all of this. We did all of this. right? And they all include creating collective forms, for example, of food production. You know, what are called in Argentina, los comedores populares, comedores populares. These are popular kitchen, collective kitchen, where maybe 10, 15 women and men, you know, are cooking together. So that not every person has to cook, so that the process of cooking is a collective one. And that process is transformed, because it's not only, you know, doing the work, but it's also in the process of carrying on the work. Knowledge is communicated, affective relationship are constructed, a whole community is developed. And so in the process of the cooking, not only this makes food available to a lot of people who may not have been able to access it, but also creates a whole new world of social relation, and a world that is very important at the time of crisis, when crisis becoming an element of everyday life. And so the ability to, in fact, have people around you, to reconstitute what, in fact, is being continuously under attack. And in fact, as part of this, recollectivization of land, recommunalization, I call it the reconstruction of the commons, right? And fight against the privatization of life. We also, have seen, as part of this process that there has been, for example, new forms, collective forms of decision making. More and more the habit, the practice of the assembly, the neighborhood assembly, the making decision not in isolation, but making decision, in an assembly form, right? This is also the growth of these new forms of assembly as really indicative. It is a good example, of a transformation, of a process of transformation of daily life that not only intensifies the possibility of resistance, because in order to fight, in order to make a fight against such powerful, corporation like an oil company, or powerful institution like the International Monetary Fund, right? You need, in effect, all the strength of the community, right? So not only actually gives more power to the struggle, but at the same time also begins to set the foundation of a new kind of society, right? Because if we want to transform, if it is true that this war that is organized against the reproduction of life across the world, right, is systemic. Its part is an inherent, inevitable, essential, intrinsic part of the capitalist system. Then there is no question that whatever struggle we make, whatever struggle is taking place on this world, has to include within itself a transformative element, has to include within itself a moment of constitution, reconstitution, has to lay the foundation for a new society. A new society is not growing out of nothing. A new world is not growing out of nothing. It's going to grow out of a long process of experimentation. And that process of experimentation has to take place in the course of our struggle. No struggle can continue, can grow. No struggle can actually really transform the society unless it has this moment, right? Unless it is changing the relation among people. And changing in a way has to oppose the way in which everything is done so that we are divided, so that we fight against each other, so we see each other as enemies. We see each other as a threat to our security, as a threat to our life, which is what we encounter today, and on every level. So I think that this question of the reconstruction of communal forms of life and the opposition, reclaiming of the land and reclaiming of the commons at all levels, communal land, but also communal relation, communal forms of reproduction, right? And it's one of the most important elements, I think, of these new forms of struggle. And part of it, and this is something I've really learned and has had a big impact also on my thinking, has been the importance of reconstructing collective memory. The question of memory as an instrument of resistance, right? Memory of the struggle that have taken place in the past, memory of those who have died in the effort to make a new society, memory, of our history, the question of memory and recreating a collective memory, right? Not as a formal celebration of what is past, right? But rather seeing that the past is still active in the present. The past is still active in the present. The injustices of the past still demand to be addressed. Those who have died fighting for a good cause, they cannot be forgotten, in the sense that, realizing that there has to be a process, almost, I would call it reincarnation, in the sense that those who are active today have to be the eyes, have to be the ears, have to be the voice of those who have been silenced, those who are no longer with us. And nevertheless, they have opened a path, they open a struggle. So this is something very important. And I think this is also so strong, especially in Latin America, because of the presence, I think in Latin America more than many other parts of the world, of indigenous communities that, have been under attack for, 500, 600 years, but nevertheless have been able to maintain sometimes communal land, and also maintain some of their communal relationship. And so I think that their presence has been a very important element, in Latin America, but also in Canada. I would say sometimes that there's been an indigenization of the feminist movement, right? Indigenization in the sense that the sacred relation that indigenous people have had with the land, and sacred relations, I put sacred in quote, but sacred relation that they've had also with the past, with the memory, has also affected, the feminism, the popular grassroots-based feminism that is growth, in these countries. And of course, there has been at the same time, this has not been, critically accepted. And I want to mention here the work of an important Guatemaltecan feminist, activist, and theoretician, Gladys Tsutsur, who has written really beautiful pages on the significance of communal system in the highland of Totonicapán in Guatemala, where she has described very powerfully what does it mean to grow up in a communal setup. What does it mean when you are 9 years old and you are immediately told, that, you are part of a community, and even within your small means, there's something you can do for your community. And to feel that you're not alone in the world, that you are surrounded. And the world around you is something that is not taken away from you. And she talks about how her community has struggled for, but she has also been part of a struggle to depatriarchalize, indigenism, to depatriarchalize, for example, to make sure that when women in an indigenous community marry outside of the indigenous group, they are not penalized. They don't lose the right to the land. So what I'm trying to portray is that what is at stake, it's a profound process, of transformation that I think I'm afraid I don't want to exceed too much my time, but a process of transformation that I think is extremely important because not only it is intensified the capacity for resistance, and but also because in a way it is the foundation for a long-term process of transformation. It's part of a process of experimentation of what it means to create a new society, to be a new society in which neither our lives, neither our bodies, nor the land in which we live, it's taken away from us, it's privatized, it's used not as a way to give us life, but as a means of exploitation, as a means of accumulation, and a means of destruction. Clearly, these processes are not sufficient to defeat this monstrous world in which we now live. We need, obviously, large movements against war, against militarization, right? But at the same time, unless we transform the day-to-day, unless we transform the way in which we produce our life and begin to create a texture, and a common ground. And I think the struggle over social reproduction is a powerful common ground, because social reproduction includes all the most important activities, that give us life, health, food. The issue of food sovereignty, for example, is very, very important. Now, women across the world now are creating seed banks. Seed banks so you don't depend on Monsanto, you don't depend on Bayer, you don't depend on genetically modified food, and seed banks is to, preserve, the original, seeds, so that several movements can come together, because reproduction means healthcare, means education, means food production, agriculture. It's a terrain in which we can actually form really a texture, a web of resistance that is also the web on which a new society can be created. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Federici, especially for the clarity of putting first things first and also pointing beyond the despair of our times. So I'll call the first discussant, Ruth Catameriche.
Okay, thank you so much, Claire. And I also want to thank the organizing team behind the Global Seminar Series. Thank you for bringing Professor Federici closer to us here at MISA. And Prof, we thank you for the hope that you give through your immense contributions, not only to the body of literature, but to our understanding of the world and the world we live in and possibilities of a future, maybe better world. So I have about 3 major reflections and then about 4 or 5 questions. And my first reflection comes from the discussion on globalization. Globalization, as you discuss, as a form of primitive accumulation today. And this is globalization as primitive accumulation, especially imposed on a global scale. And as you have rightly discussed, this has been activated especially through continents like Africa through structural adjustment programs, and how globalization should be looked at not from the neoliberal sense, but as an attack on the basic means of production, as an attack on land, as an attack on houses, as an attack on wages, because increasingly we see that regardless of how much a person works, people are still poor. Recently in Uganda, someone said that's the crisis, that you work so hard, but you still can't afford even the basics of life. So I want to thank you for that major reflection, but also to look at globalization as a policy of recolonization. And this, just like former phases of capitalism, it comes with the same violence, it comes with the same witch hunts, if I'm to use the word. But also key to what globalization looks like is the violence of its exploitation, the increasing trafficking of even body organs, the sale of hair, all these that are within this structure that continues to accumulate, but increasingly that the site of accumulation is even moving towards the body itself. And that leads me to my second reflection. And the second reflection is on the relationship you draw between women, nature, and capitalism. From Caroline Merchant, capitalism treats women the same way it treats nature. The structure of patriarchy asserts its violence on nature the same way it asserts its violence against women. And it assumes that nature, just like women, is passive. And that way it keeps on extracting. It extracts from nature the same way it extracts from women's bodies. And the discussion around technologies, new technologies that continuously continue to use the women's bodies as new commons. Technologies around IVF, technologies around egg transplants and placenta, surrogate births, as these not being neutral, these are not innocent technologies, but an assertion of patriarchy, an assertion of the violence of capitalism that is sustained, that is continuously asserting itself and using bodies, such as bodies of women. And that reminds me of recently, I saw a tweet of a Chinese doctor who says they are coming up with a certain technology that will help women not have the menstrual periods throughout the year, but you can only have it 4 times in a year. And that is increasingly how violent and how much capitalism continuously innovates around how it can extract much from women's bodies. My third reflection concerns the discussion on primitive accumulation, and this is coming from the readings that you shared. That primitive accumulation is not a historical, it could be a historical event, but it is a continuous process. And your insights that, yes, Marx did what he did, but we need to build on what Marx has done. And you do that explicitly through your work around the witch hunts and how primitive accumulation, witch hunts enabled witch hunts and the confinement of women into the domain of the private domain, and how that sustained the process of capitalist accumulation. And you in a way call upon us to find new subjects from which we can theorize, new subjects through which we can understand the process of primitive accumulation. And that reminds me of Professor May's famous question of who is your subject, and the relevance or the importance of challenging dominant narratives from the vantage point of our different subjects who probably have been written out of literature. So my questions, my first question is around the notion of the commons. And I want to adopt a definition you use in one of the readings you give us, that this is the struggle for commons should be looked at as resistance against the neoliberal attempt to subordinate every form of life, every form of logic, every form of knowledge to the logic of the market, that it is increasingly becoming hard or impossible to relate with one another, to relate with life, to relate with the environment, to even relate with knowledge without or outside the nexus of cash. And my question is focusing around the knowledge commons. And I'm curious because somewhere else in your other works, you have discussed the destruction, or rather the criminalization of gossip as an entry point for understanding the devaluation of women's knowledge. You say that before the 16th century, gossip was friendship. Gossip was not evil. But after the 16th century, which is also around the same time the witch hunts happen, gossip then becomes empty talk, it becomes malevolent talk, it becomes mischievous talk, which is mostly done by women. And again, this is around the same time the witch hunts are happening. So I've always been curious to ask you, what was the connection between gossip and primitive accumulation? Because that were happening around the same time. I ask this because we continue to see structures of silencing women's knowledge systems. Say when agrarian modernization comes, knowledge around seeds, knowledge around seasons, knowledge around weather patterns, most of which women had, now shifts to the logics of the market, that you have to go to an agriculture show, you have to go to a workshop for you to obtain knowledge on how to grow a crop you have probably been growing for all these generations. So that nexus between knowledge systems, especially knowledge of women, and accumulation. My second question is around feminism and ecology. And you have rightly discussed the relationship between women and nature, and the related portrayal of nature as female, the notion of Mother Earth. And Caroline Marchant again argues that the violence of ecological devastation is as patriarchal as the violence against women. And again, this carries capitalist logics within it. But you are against the reduction of struggles for protection of the environment, for ecological protection, the reduction of these struggles to only, we need to protect the earth because earth is mother and earth is female and women are earth, right? But you argue that that is paradoxical in a way. We cannot say we want to protect nature because it's female, but yet on the other hand, the broader movement is against gender-based discrimination, right? So my question is, what difference does it make? Because there are parts of the world where nature is being preserved based on the logics of Mother Earth, of female. So that vis-a-vis ecological protection, the fight against ecological destruction based on the understanding of nature as crucial to care work. So if both patterns or if both processes yield results, what difference does it make when we go beyond essentializing femininity in the protection of nature? My third question, this is of much interest to me, and this is around the urban as new sites of reproduction, which you have rightly discussed. That today we increasingly see trends of migration, especially from the rural to the urban, of course, coming from structures of dispossession and the massive creation of poor people. But with this migration has also come a change in the site of reproduction, from the physical confines of the household now to much more public spaces. That today in cities like Kampala, it is very easy for you to find a person washing clothes in a public place. It is very easy for you to find someone doing work that was initially or originally meant to be confined to a space of a house. It is very easy for you to find people doing that work in a public space like a street, like a city square. And I'm wondering, could we look at this as a movement towards a recreation of communitarian lives, as you argue? Because in a way, they are going beyond the logics of capitalism that wants to confine certain forms of work to a particular isolated space. So how should we understand such a change in the site of reproduction? But also, yeah, that's the question. My fourth, oh, I have about 5, so one to go. So my fourth question.
Very good.
My fourth question is on the nexus between social reproduction and technology. That today we have new forms of technology that make work around the house very easy. Why should I break my back if I can get a washing machine, if I can get a vacuum cleaner, right? And one would say this is taking away work that should have been done by another person. But if something has come up and it can allow you more control over your time, then why wouldn't one use it? But again, we understand that technology is not neutral. We cannot just celebrate technologies, and yet they are built on capitalist logics, logics of extraction, logics of massive land dispossession, logics of poisoning water, as you have been discussing. So my question is, how should the feminist movement relate with technology? Especially to go beyond what technology does, but also inquiring into how these particular technologies are being produced. Should we look at technology as just revolutionary? Or how should we then relate with it if we are to inquire into the various processes that undertone the creation of these technologies? And finally, my final question relates to sovereignty, state sovereignty, power within the nation state. And the reasoning is borrowed from Wendy Brown's Warning Democracies, Warning States and Warning Democracies. So from your discussion and from the readings, but also from what we increasingly see, we see that questions of survival are increasingly being determined by capital. That today it becomes increasingly hard for one to speak about control of bodies, control of food, control over water, control over power, the power to life, the power to death, the necro and biopolitics, as squarely within the technologies of state power, and particularly the power of the nation state. Increasingly, we see that the richer someone is, the more likely they are to survive. That if 2 people got liver failure or kidney damage today, one with money may have more control over their life and the consequences of their life than one without money. But one would say that these are happening within the confines of the state. But really, this is a state that looks like it's responding to capital. So what is the place of state power in the context of nation state? And what does this mean to our understanding of state sovereignty? So I'll stop here. I once again thank you, Prof, for your enormous contribution. And I thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Federici. We have the other discussant, and then we give you a chance to respond.
Yeah.
I'll invite Dr. Lugnago to offer the second
for sharing and
discussion, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Professor Federici, for this illuminating talk and for sharing these wonderful reading materials. So my discussion will be based on the reading of the 5 texts which were shared by Professor Federici and parts of the presentation that she made. So my intention is not to give a reading of each individual text, but to tease out the contribution she makes throughout these 5 texts. So broadly, Professor Federici is trying to do 2 things. First, to make sense of the multiple political, economic, social, and ecological crises that the world is facing today. And the second is to make sense of the forms of grassroots responses or struggles against the processes that are leading to these crises as a way of establishing an alternative. So broadly, Professor Federici expands the feminist critique of capitalism through the question of social reproduction. She is not only interested in understanding how capitalism produces commodities, but most importantly, how it organizes, exploits, and destroys the very conditions that make life possible. In engaging the concept of social reproduction, Professor Federici refers to the activities, relations, and resources through which life is sustained. For instance, think of care work, food production, ecological relations, community organizing, and others. So her central claim across the texts is that capitalism is engaged in a continuous war against these conditions because they represent spaces of emancipation which are far beyond the total control of the market. So as such, the struggles over land, food, ecology, women's labor, and communities are not distinct struggles. They are all struggles over who controls the conditions of life. So through the text, Professor Federici, I will speak to about 3 interventions that she makes. The first intervention that she makes is to expand our understanding of capitalist accumulation. Rather than viewing capitalism only through exploitation within production, she argues that capitalism depends on separating people from the resources and the relations that allow them to reproduce themselves. And this is where her reinterpretation of primitive accumulation beyond the traditional Marxist articulation becomes very important. For Professor Federici, primitive accumulation is not simply the historical process that created capitalism through enclosures, through dispossessions, and colonial conquest. It is an ongoing process through which capitalism continuously expands. So this historical framing allows her to understand the process of globalization, land privatization, extractive industries, displacements, among others, as continuing forms of enclosure. This does not only point to the loss of land, but the loss of people's ability to reproduce themselves independently of capital. She writes, and I quote, "To think of the world political economy through the prism of primitive accumulation is to place ourselves immediately in a battlefield." End quote. So this transforms the struggle over land, food, and ecology into struggles over survival and autonomy. So she extends this to contexts like Palestine and other places where that have become sites of dispossession. So, and she argues what a whole social production system is being systematically dismantled. So the second intervention stems from Professor Federici's argument that the war on reproduction is fundamentally a feminist struggle. Her argument is not simply that women experience capitalism differently. Rather, capitalism has historically organized the production through gendered relations, making women's unpaid and undervalued labor central to its survival. So this challenges the separation between economic production and social reproduction. And it makes activities such as care work, household labor, and subsistence agriculture as not lying outside capitalism, rather as forming part of its foundations. In post-patriarchy, Professor Federici describes reproduction as, quote, the most important condition of our existence. So, however, Professor Federici does not argue that women are naturally connected to reproduction. Rather, she emphasizes the historical knowledge and political existence women have developed because they have been placed at the center of struggle over sustaining life. So this in turn connects feminism directly to ecological struggles and struggles over nature. As she argues, capitalism exploits both women and nature through similar process of appropriation. As both women's reproductive labor and nature are treated as resources available for extraction. And this explains her claim that ecological struggles have increasingly become feminist struggles, and thus a mainstay of feminist politics. So Professor Federici describes this process as the feminization of resistance to ecological destruction. Women are therefore not only affected by destruction or reproduction, they are also central political actors trying to resist it. She draws on the concept of body territory emerging from the indigenous and communitarian feminist struggles in Latin America to deepen this argument and to challenge the separation between the body and the environment by showing that destruction of territories is simultaneously destruction of bodies and forms of life. So the body becomes a site of struggle because environmental violence is experienced through health, reproductive capacities, labor, everyday survival, and others. And the third intervention from her work is in the alternative path she cultivates. Professor Federici does not only offer a critique of capitalism, she also attempts to imagine alternative forms of organizing life. Her way out is found in the politics of the commons, what in her talk she called the reconstruction of the communal forms of life. So commons are not simply shared resources. They represent transformation in social relations and in how communities reproduce themselves. In Feminism and the Politics of the Commons, she contends that, quote, if commoning has any meaning, it must be the reproduction of ourselves as a common subject, end quote. And to reconstruct the commons calls for transformation of our everyday life as a way to bring together what capitalism has obliterated. The commons therefore represent not only an alternative economic arrangement, but a different way of organizing reproduction based on cooperation, based on collective responsibility and care. This rightly connects to her broader political vision of a post-patriarchal world. Professor Federici argues, and I quote, to imagine a post-patriarchal world then is to imagine a world free from the scourges the patriarchal capitalist exploitation of humans and nature has produced, end quote. So she envisions a society where production serves human needs rather than endless accumulation, one based on equitable sharing of resources, of wealth, and importantly, one based on what the banishment of all forms of exploitation. So through these three interventions, Professor Federici provides a powerful framework for understanding capitalism as a war against social reproduction. I have a few questions, theoretical political questions that I would like to seek some clarifications on from Professor Federici. And the first one relates to the post-patriarchal vision that she thinks of. So Professor Federici's post-patriarchal vision appears to be inseparable from the transformation of capitalist relations. But patriarchy has existed in different historical and cultural forms across different contexts. So it's the struggle against patriarchy, is the struggle that we have to engage in against patriarchy in general, or specifically against capitalist patriarchy. How do we distinguish the different forms of patriarchal organization without reducing all of them to capitalism? And why your choice of post-patriarchy and not post-capitalism? Because you suggest that we cannot do away with post-patriarchy without doing away with capitalism. So why not post-capitalism and instead post-patriarchy? Do the two concepts mean the same? Or are they different? So this takes me to my second question, which Ruth also spoke to partly. So, which is on the alternative form of organizing that you suggest, the commons. So Professor Federici suggests an alternative which emphasizes communities, commons, and collective forms of reproduction. However, capitalism is also reproduced through the state. For instance, through the law, regimes of property, policies, political institutions, and many others. And in the recent past, feminist scholars have emphasized the tripartite relationship between the state, the market, and the household or the family. The alternative provided seems to put emphasis on reconfiguring the market and the society, and not the state. If the war on social reproduction is politically organized, as we can think of the context of Palestine and many other places, so can its transformation occur without transforming the state? And what role does the state have in this common-based society that is being imagined as an alternative? So similarly, which is my third question, Professor Federici presents the commons as alternatives to capitalism. Communities may also, but we understand that communities may also contain gender inequalities, tribal, ethnic, religious divisions, unequal power relations, and many others. So in this commoning that we are looking at, how do we ensure that the common spaces don't become only spaces of emancipation and not places where you're going to reproduce the existing hierarchies and forms of marginalization? In other words, how do we imagine the commons in practice? We can learn from the practical lessons of Ujamaa villagization in Tanzania, which eventually reproduced some forms of hierarchies of exclusion and exploitation. So my fourth question is out of curiosity. So you emphasize the women's historical role in sustaining life. How do we reinforce knowledge and struggles around reproduction without reinforcing the assumption that care is naturally women's responsibility? Of course, in the talk, you talked about the ongoing appropriation of some of these struggles by the neoliberal institutions like the UN and many others. And lastly, across different contexts, people experience the violence of capitalism quite differently. And so, for instance, and of course, the responses to some of it has also been different in different places. So how can this framework that you suggest majorly drawing from Latin America, be extended to understand relations and struggles within different contexts like Africa. For instance, in Africa, and particularly in Uganda, in northern Uganda, some forms of communal life have been existing, and they've been seen as spaces where struggles against capital and its violence have been experienced. So, how possible is it that the framework you suggest can work across contexts? And perhaps what are the limitations of your envisioned communal society or post-patriarchal society? So, thank you. I will end here.
Yeah.
Professor Federici, the floor is yours to respond to the discussant, whatever you feel to respond to.
Okay. So, wow, first of all, I'm very, very, very grateful for this very powerful question. They're very important. They're all very, very, and I'll do my best because there's a lot of them. But they're very useful to me too, because I think that they really allow me, in fact, to clarify many of the points that I was trying to make. So I'll go in order. I'll start with the, first of all, I had to make a choice. When I realized I had enough, I had to make a choice as to what to concentrate upon. So at the time when also there is a tremendous sense, certainly I know in the United States, there's a tremendous sense of despair. There are struggles, in the US as well, but at the same time, the extent to which the cruelty we see, the destruction that we see, the way that no attempt is even made, the destruction is not new, although it's becoming more and more intense. But the way it is now, no apologies for it, right? And this creates a sense of almost impotence in many activist circles. So I was really particularly concerned with emphasizing, important struggles, that are taking place, emphasizing that, not only there is resistance, but also we see that this resistance is transforming life. But obviously, this was by no means a full-blown, perspective that I presented. But let me answer the question. First of all, the questions about knowledge commons, right? The question of knowledge commons. Yes, I wrote an article on the question of gossip. In the process, of studying the witch hunts, and I want to come back to the witch hunts of today because they were very, very important. Witch hunting has not stopped. On the contrary, together with the development of a policy of neoliberalism, globalization, we have seen a return of witch hunting, and not only in several countries of Africa, but across the world, throughout India, in parts of Asia, Papua New Guinea, and very close connected in all this area with the question of land dispossession. It has been said and written that in Africa, for example, for an old women who do not have people behind them ready to defend them, to have some land, to have access to land, to inherit land becomes often a death sentence, because as availability of land is shrinking, bloody wars about land, have taken place. And the attack on women, particularly older women, the executor are often young men, right? Dispossessed, who don't see any future. But of course, behind them, there are broader interests. Behind them, there are very broader interests, local chief in complicity with, corporation, with companies who are interested in privatizing land, in land expropriation. So the whole issue of witch hunting is still as important, as crucial today, as certainly it was, at the beginning of capitalist development. And it's very, very, but studying the witch hunt, I realized something about the word gossip, that in the Middle Ages, in England in the Middle Ages, the word gossip meant female friend. You basically said, I go out with my gossip, and in a popular literature, women were always represented, with their gossips, right? There's a famous mystery play that I quoted in my article, where a husband goes to the tavern and, he sees his wife with her friends, with her gossip, and says to her, let's go, the flood is coming, we have to get into the ark. And she says, I will not go unless I go with my gossip. By the 17th century, together with the process of witch hunting, together with all set of policies that are incentivizing the beginning of a nuclear family, transferring the emphasis on communal relation to the relation within the nuclear family, we see a change. Gossip becomes a devalued word. Gossip becomes idle knowledge, actually even malign, backbiting. Yeah, it's what women do. You don't say that men gossip. Men gossip, right? And it's part of a devaluation, both of women's knowledges and a devaluation of women's relation, of women's communal, women's friendship. It's part of the change in the concept of gossip is a reflection and an instrument at the same time, right? A reflection and an instrument of the attack on communal relation, and in particular female friendships. So there's always an idea that gossip is connected with ideas of rebellions, right? And it's part of a transformation in the concept of what is the acceptable role of women in society, where women have to become basically expropriated of agency. Women have to be under the control of men. And, women have to be modest, obedient, and housebound, do their work, and so forth. So thank you for reminding me. And also on the broader issue is that, yes, commons are not just earthly commons. We're not talking only about land or sea commons. We're talking also about knowledge commons. There's been a whole literature by particularly Italian autonomists on talking about the internet as a common, as a knowledge common, right? And basically, the digital world as potentially providing a knowledge. I'm very skeptical about that, because when you think about how much destruction of water and earth the digitalization implies, right? So this knowledge common that the internet is actually built on the destruction of a lot of earthly common. For example, it consumes, tremendous amount of water. So that's a whole issue in itself. The second question was the feminist ecology. What is a feminist ecology? To me, the question of a feminist ecology, the issue, I think that it has been very oppressive. Of course, there's a whole feminist literature about it, which I share, for women to have been designated, right, as the primary and almost, exclusive subject of the reproduction of life and care work, right? And this has been very oppressive. Women have paid a high price for it. At the same time, the fact that historically, for generation of capitalism, women have been the one who have produced life, who have been in charge, under very oppressive conditions, but dealing with child raising, dealing with taking care of older people, taking care of food production, has actually generated a consciousness of the value and fragility of life that is not available, for example, to people who have spent their life producing cars, right? And so in this sense, I'm saying that there's been a sensitivity which has nothing to do with biology, but has to do with the fact it's not an accident that for generations, until recently, women have not been part of the armies. Women have not been the executioner, right? And not because they've been biologically incapable of that. Of course not. We see it now. We see women police, we see women entering the army. It gives me a great pain to see women fighting to join the armies. I think we should have men out of the army. We should say equality has to work the other way around. Men out of the army, no more armies, no more war. But I'm saying it is the fact that women, the designation of women as the nurturer, and I see that it's not an accident, that it's mostly women's group in our time who have insisted that a future society, if we change the world, if our struggle create a new world, this new world must be one that places life, the value of life at the center. This has become a common slogan, placing the value of life at the center, not a life built on profit, accumulation of private wealth, but a life in which the wealth we produce and the natural wealth is shared, in which we don't even speak of property, in which relation to nature is a relation of use and not abuse. It's not a relation of property. We don't own nature. We don't own the field. We don't own the water. So I think that this is extremely important. And it's nothing again to do with biology, but has to do with the whole history of care work. Now, the third question before the urbanization, yeah, I'm very intrigued. I'm very intrigued about this. Learning that, for example, in Kampala, I was in Kampala. I've been in Kampala a couple of times. That in Kampala, there are now women who are doing their reproductive work in public space, particularly washing clothes. It brings back memory. I come from Italy. And, when you travel in Italy, in the older towns, when you travel in Europe, you often find in the middle of the town, you still find the big cement tubs where in the Middle Age or until the 16th, 17th century, women would go to wash their clothing. For example, washing their clothing was never something you did as many other reproductive activity, was not something that you did individually. You always did it collectively, so the big cement tub where, the women went and of course changed the nature of the work. It's different to do this work in the isolation of your home, in the isolation where you only experience the fatigue, and to do it collectively, where you meet women, you exchange information, you develop the viewpoint about what is happening, you learn what is happening in the community, you develop a kind of a viewpoint. It's a very, very different, and this is the same experience that I was referring to when I was talking about the collective kitchens that you find in Latin America, and that always also are reproduced a moment of struggle. So this is a very, I would like to understand more about this question of urbanization and the reappropriation. Yeah, I think that what it shows is this appropriation of the public space that goes hand in hand also with the appropriation that I know is taking place in many parts of Africa of any land that is not used, any land that is not used, you know, to grow some food, to not be dependent completely on the market. You know, I read articles that shown that some of the African urban centers, you know, they look like the gardens because women and communities are taking over land and they are planting things. And this is happening not only in Africa, it's happening in the Philippines. You know, I heard of places in the Philippines, people are sowing food, sowing seeds, you know, even in the you know, around the places where, you know, trains are passing. Any kind of land that is not used is now being recuperated. So much is the need not to be completely dependent on the market at the time, you know, as the first commentator was pointing out, you know, money available, it's continuously diminishing, you know, where the wages one earn do not provide for the necessities of life. So the full question was about technology and the washing machine and so on. I think the issue of technology is very, very important. In fact, this is one of the things I'm working on now. First of all, I want to say that we have to resist a lot of the you know, ideology that is now being propagated continuously, you know, about how we are now developing a technology that is going to replace practically every form of work, you know, and this celebration of AI, right, which already is, you know, the realization of data centers is already new level of destruction, right, is already, you know, responsible for new forms of expropriation and new forms of destruction. Data centers are also depending on tremendous use of energy, tremendous use of water. I think we need to demystify the power of technology, of capitalist technology. I think we need to make a difference. You know, the technology that capitalism has developed has never been devised with in mind alleviating human labor, right? If that had been the case, we would live in a paradise. Has always been devised with the idea of increasing the forms of exploitation, increasing the exploitation of labor, and, you know, dismantling the organization of workers, dismantling the forms of organization the workers have set up to resist that exploitation. So technology has always been anti-work, has always been as at the service of exploitation. So we need to make a distinction between technology and technology, because although it is true that potentially, you know, technology, you know, can alleviate, you know, our work, but historically and to the present, technology, the development of technology, and in fact, most of it, you know, interesting that a lot of the technology that's been developed has been a product of warfare, a product of what has been learned and experimented, you know, in the creation of armament. So there's been a constant spillover, not accidental, of technological development, you know, developed to make arms more potent, more destructive, and the technology which are then filtered into and applied into the workplace. So we have to be very careful. So I think part of the work that we need to do, in the reconstruction of a society, in the construction, is to devise new forms of technology. And so I think that there's a whole path to technological development that so far has been blocked because it has not served the goals of accumulation. And by the way, I want to say something again about AI, right? We are constantly told that artificial intelligence is now going to take care of work, and God knows what is going to happen to human beings, right? Yeah, so there's a whole echo of, destruction of human life, because if it is true that AI, we know that the capitalism is not going to support, millions of people, yeah, who will not have a purpose in their scheme of development. But it's very interesting. We are told that AI will replace labor, but what is being forgotten is that the largest amount of labor on earth, which is the labor to reproduce, the care of human beings on a day-to-day basis, child care of people who are sick, care for the elderly, care for the people who are not self-sufficient. That care that represents the largest amount of labor on earth is not labor that can be technologized. I know that if we continuously hear that, there's going to be this little robot who will keep us company, the little robot, that we can play with when we are alone, all alone in our home, they will help us. And maybe there will be a day a robot that is going to give us a bath. But really, can we believe that? Can really believe, not only in terms of the cost of what you mean to provide robots, how much land, how many water, how many trees have to be destroyed to provide robots that take care of the billions and billions and billions of hours of work that are necessary to do the care work of the world. But the idea that anybody will give their newborn babies, or they will give their elderly who are not self-sufficient in the hand of a robot, right? It's completely crazy. So, there is a level of mystification that we continuously have to be, fighting against, totally mystified. I do a lot of care work. A good part of my day is spent in doing care work, as my partner is not self-sufficient, unfortunately. And I can tell you, never the work will be replaced by a machine. Yeah, and not accidentally, there is now a constant complaint in the United States, the most advanced country technologically, because women are not producing enough children. 25% of young women in age of reproduction are now deciding not to have children. And there is a constant war about it. And in fact, several states have even passed laws that forbid abortion. There is a whole attack on women's ability to control their reproduction. So there is a recognition, in fact, that that capitalism needs new workers. So we need to be aware of this contradiction, that we are told, no, human beings are not necessary any longer. The machine will do everything. But women are not producing enough workers. We have an aging workforce. An aging workforce is not creative enough. So we hear these two discourses together, and we have to expose this contradiction so that we don't believe the rhetoric, because it's a rhetoric that in a way, forces us to accept any condition of work. Because if it is true that machine will take place, then we will hold on to any kind of work that is offered. The question of sovereignty, the question of the nation state, and yeah, I think this is a very, very important question, and I'm glad that both the commentators brought it out. And it's a question that I think requires, a tremendous amount of work. And I don't claim that I am now, it's something that I think we need to work upon collectively, because it is a number of things. First of all, it is very clear that particularly today, right, I've been very enthusiastic and stressing the power of activities that are restoring communal life. At the same time, there is no question, and I should have mentioned it, that we cannot not engage continuously in our everyday struggle and life with the state, right? We have to engage with the state and struggle to obtain, changes in the laws to force the state to increase investment in reproduction. But we have to be extremely careful here and understand what kind of reforms we are fighting first. We are fighting for, because there are reforms that are actually increasing the power of everybody, that are actually, for example, reforms that have abolished, that they went against, racial discrimination. They have increased everybody's power. And there are reforms who are satisfying the needs only of one section, who seem to be, an advantage. They seem to be a form of progress, but actually are satisfying the need of one sector of the workforce. And those reforms, have a pacification effect, and in fact do not resolve the process of the problem, but actually serve, a divisive goal. Secondly, the future, right? What is the role of the state in the future? Yeah, this is something certainly I did not develop. Personally, I think that looking forward, that it's difficult today to actually anticipate, because we are in a situation in which our own political imagination is limited. The situation we are living now is such that our own political imagination is very limited. I think in the process of the struggle, much will become clarified. All I can anticipate is that I do not believe that a society that, treasures the possibility of real democracy means self-government. Real democracy means self-government. It's difficult to imagine real democracy, in communities of millions of people, in nation states of millions of people, where inevitably decisions are constantly delegated, so that perhaps alternative forms of organization of power have to be devised, which today are difficult to imagine and comprehend because, of the situation in which we are living. But for example, I'm thinking of some of the organization of society, in pre-Columbian America, where you had network of self-governed community, network of community. I'm thinking, of again, thinking of, for example, of pre-capitalist the southeastern areas of Nigeria, where you had the small villages that were, connected with each other, but at the same time did not have a state, did not have state power. What about a future in which we will not have state power, the delegation of power to a state, to an institution that is removed, that takes away the capacity for self-government from people? These are the issues that I'm troubled with. These are the issues that I think we need to collectively think upon, right? But I think that what we can concentrate upon with some hopes of success is the present, right? And to keeping in mind, what do we mean by democracy? What do we mean by democracy? Democracy means a form of making decision, capacity to make decision collectively about our life. Then what does it mean? What kind of state can really represent that kind of democracy? These are really very open questions. I'm really, really looking forward to hear anybody's thought on this matter. Now, this as far as the first set of questions, and I don't know if the first commentator, unfortunately, I didn't see the name, want to say something about my comments, or should I move on to the second set of questions? Should I move on to the second?
With the second, proceed to the second discussant, and then we open to the floor. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay, so this, yeah, I think there was a misunderstanding in terms of the first question. I didn't think, and that in my writing or in my words today, I gave priority to post-patriarchal versus post-capitalist. I absolutely agree. Post-capitalist and post-patriarchal at the same have to be combined. Post-patriarchy and capitalism is a patriarchal system. Abolishing patriarchy has been a transhistorical phenomenon, but of course it has taken different forms. For example, there's been a time in which patriarchy was a lot of based on physical power, which is not being the case for more modern forms of patriarchy. Yeah. For example, I wrote a book called, The Patriarchy of the Wage, in which I've emphasized the role of money in enforcing patriarchy within capitalism. And this is what we are confronting today. The role of money and unwaged labor in enforcing patriarchy and creating the hierarchy, how the wage and wagelessness, has been instrumental to create and maintain racial but absolutely, I agree with the first question. Absolutely, post-capitalism, not just post-patriarchal, is not enough. What we need to eliminate, what we need to create is a world that is not centered, built upon the exploitation of human labor and the creation of constant hierarchies built on gender, built on race, built on age, and the instruments, that monetary and otherwise, that are used to perpetuate them. The second question was yes, I think the second question, I wrote very fast and I cannot read my own notes, but I think the second question, and please correct me if I'm not clear, has to do with the question of the state, right? In other words, what is the role of the state? And again, today the state is really in control, of the means of our reproduction. Therefore, there's no question, and I hope I did not leave this unclear. There's no question that we can retake control of the reproduction of our life without a continuous exchange, interchange, and struggle against, the state, because the state holds, the means of our reproduction, right? So, for instance, when I was, discussing often in the United States, I talk about my experience with women in Latin America, in Argentina, in Brazil, and I say, women are doing this and this, they're organizing, assemblies, they're organizing communal garden, they're organizing, and then one reply I often receive here, but why are they, why they're replacing the state? Why they're replacing the state? By doing this, by organizing our reproduction, don't we, in a sense, let the state off the hook, right? Shouldn't we instead have the state? And my answer has always been that what women are doing, they're doing it in situations in which there's no state present in the community, right? For example, I visited encampments, where women were organizing to take the children to school because there were no crosslights, and often they were being run over. Where the poverty was such that older people in their homes sometimes starved to death, and they would basically create check on people that they knew do they have enough food, right? There was no really health care present, right? And so, they would create groups that with herbs and some form of first aid would provide some health care. But at the same time, in doing those activities, they created a strong bonding that then enabled them to go to the city, to the municipal building, and confront the state, with the power of their constituted unity, and say, come, bring water to our community, install some water pipe, bring electricity, so that in fact this commoning in the process of reproduction, created also a strength which then allowed them to confront the state. So it's not that when I speak of commoning, particularly at this stage, we're talking about forgetting the existence of the state. On the contrary, the state has within its hand all the means of the reproduction of life. The question is, how do we create the strength? How do we create the strength? How do we overcome the isolation that we live? And that isolation is a weakness, right? How get and come together, not episodically, not today, this struggle, and tomorrow we go home alone, but we do it in a way that is continuous and that is transforming our life materially and as far as relation, emotionally, affectively. That, I think, what I'm talking about, not forgetting the state, but instituting a new relation with the state, by creating also new forms of organization of our day-to-day reproduction. And then, So, okay, so if I understand the question of yes, that patriarchal relation, yes, the commons can be patriarchal, no question, absolutely. And I mentioned Gladys Utsul. See, I mentioned Gladys Utsul because she has been part of a struggle, very important, and this is very, very important, because the patriarchal character, the potentially patriarchal character of some communal forms of life, right, has been used by bourgeois feminists, by neoliberal feminism, to advocate privatization, to advocate, the privatization of lands, right? So, for example, the idea is, because communal relation has often been patriarchal, then let's decommunalize. We go beyond patriarchy. So I have money, I have my own land, and this I get rid of the patriarchal control. And I think the struggle, there is now a struggle by women in communal setups, right? In communal setup, for example, in indigenous communities, right? To depatriarchalize those communities, right? To actually, in order, in fact, to save those communities, to preempt this theory, the privatization is at the service, of gender, is at the service. To preempt this idea that privatization of land, for example, is beneficial to women, right? So I think that this is a very important issue. It's a very, very important issue. Okay. Let's see. Okay, how to ensure? Yeah, I think I answered the question of how to ensure that the stressing women care work does not basically reinstitute the idea that women is a kind of biological connection, right? I think I answered that question. See, there is a whole historical connection with women, but no, it's not a matter of institutionalizing, the primacy of women in the relation of care work. Although, of course, maternity and so on does induce a larger participation of women in that care, in that work, right? The question is, we haven't seen a movement of men to actually go to the street and fight about care work. When are men going to go to the street? And I'm thinking our comrades, our brothers, and when will they go into the street and organize movement, dealing with the question of abortion, dealing with question of sexuality, dealing with question of care work? The question is that so far we have not seen men organizing over the reproduction of life. We have been asked men, not only in the privacy of our bedroom and kitchen, but we have asked men to actually go out in the street and actually support the struggle of women. When we see that, then we can also raise that question. And I want to mention here the comments that some women in Sweden, there's some women in Sweden have made to me, women, and in Scandinavian countries that have been more, quote, progressive, and basically, have given men equal time when a new baby was born they've given men equal time as to women to stay home from work, with the idea that sharing the work is important. You know what the women have said? Yeah, the men stay home, but they don't do the work. So now women said we used to get 9 months. After we gave birth, we used to have 9 months. Now we get only 6 or 5 because men are getting equal time. But we do the work and the men use the time for other things. So I think we need more engagement by men on the question of reproduction. We are still waiting. I think the women internationally are waiting. I'm not saying that there's not a lot of men who are doing important care work, but not enough. Not enough. Yeah. And I think that
Professor Federici,
yeah.
we still
The
like
last
to-
question.
Yes,
Yeah, the
if
last
you want to
question, I
respond to the
think-
last question. Last
Yes,
question
tell
was,
me the last question.
it was about
Yeah.
transcultural applicability of the idea of the common.
Right, right. I think actually my first idea of the common came from Africa. I really began to think about the commons because I come from Europe. Most of the communal land are gone. But when I was, the time I spent in Nigeria, I realized that actually a lot of the land, at least in West Africa, was still held communally. And I saw the power they gave people culturally and also with relation to work. That, when they thought about old age, they thought about returning to the village, the power of the village. I saw that when there was a strike, they could go to the village and have some food. And so, in fact, when I came back, my idea of the commons didn't come from Latin America or from my reading of medieval Europe. It really came, and I think that it's really a great tragedy. It's a great, which not to say that those communal relations were not problematic, but the idea that the alternative to communalism, to commoning, is privatization of land. And I know how violent the process of turning common land into private land has been. When the titling process was implemented, that was a violent process, breaking down communal land and giving individual title. First of all, it was a lot of money. You didn't get those titles. Yeah. And then that process was very, very, and of course, lots of women were excluded. And then, of course, there was a struggle for women for getting title to the land, which in many cases meant nothing because men had more power than them, etc., etc. So I think that transculturally, the idea of the common is as important, if not in Africa, as it is, in Latin America and Asia and in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for having been so exhaustive in the responses. So you open the floor or the floor also to the virtual room. We collect 3 questions. Please just go to the question because we don't have a lot of time. Is there a room? Yes, please. Come in. You know the room.
What question?
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my first issue is yes, a suggestion that I'm thinking that there is need to articulate this modern state, either as definitely a masculine state, or anti-feminist state, or basically an anti-life state. This is necessary to understand its making and proceed to its unmaking, because right now it is not clear what this modern state is in respect to the crisis that is ongoing. Now, the second point, which also should brief one, is the leverage women have within this dispensation of capitalism. This is a comment, my own thinking. My own thinking is that instead of looking at female women as in the perspective of reproduction of society, I'm thinking that their strongest leverage should be reproduction of life. That if they get that space and strengthen their position as the people who produce a life and mobilize around it, that is the leverage they can get against capital. But all these other leverage, I think that they cannot win. Now, a brief point again on knowledge. I'm thinking that there is a need for real serious counter knowledge to the capitalist epistemology. Capitalism is not a force, but a conviction. It comes as choice, as a desire. And if we as intellectuals today, we are finding fault with it, we need to generate a counter knowledge which is equal to what capitalism offers. And then what you talked about language, I completely agree with you that yeah, but as I also add to what you have said, that within the current intellectual language, either in English, Spanish, or Italian, that within that language, this liberation, revolution, a new order, it's not possible to use that language and articulate that type of what is required. And I also also in that street, I agree with you when you talked about the intersubjectivity of women as a strength in this language, in communicating, in the language of communicating the response to the crisis in the world today. Then so issue is what I did not agree with you is retroactivism by women and the natives, that as one of the responses which can come up against in this crisis. And here I also agree with the Professor Kasatera when he said that this is just a despair. But okay, say despair, but me I think it is martyrdom. Retroactivism, that you do what was done in the past. I think that doing what was done in the past cannot. My own belief is that it cannot really come be of use to this crisis. Then finally, on this capitalism should be appreciated the capitalist state should be appreciated as the bulwark of capitalism and this current crisis. So an engagement that does not destabilize, that does not unpack this capitalist state, it is futile. It is completely futile. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
So perhaps you can proceed addressing these questions as we. Sorry. There are another couple of questions.
Thank you, Professor. This is Joseph here.
Yes.
I just want to ask if will a post-patriarchal future society of commons be necessarily an anarchic society? Is it in a way a defense of anarchy in the progressive sense of the term? Thank you.
Let's take the one online. Can you open the one online? So
Is there another question?
Yes, let me read the loud one in the virtual room. So listening to Professor makes me feel that women have so much power they do not recognize or realize, in that they could paralyze the labor force if they choose not to produce labor. How come women do not realize their position? At what point did women get to be referred to as the weaker sex? So maybe you can start addressing these questions and then we take another round.
Okay. Right. So maybe I'll start from the last one. I thought that this last one I already discussed, before that, as I pointed out in my first answers, I don't think when I spoke about the commons, I should have made it more clear that I was not suggesting by any means that concentrating, energies, struggle, organizational effort on creating communal forms of organization, communal forms of reproduction should take away from engaging with the state. On the contrary, in fact, I was clarifying that communing with that commoning has given women power to confront the state. You don't confront the state alone. Actually, this is an old lesson. The moment you engage in struggle, a strong struggle, you have to start commoning relation. People put their lives in common. We have seen it in the United States historically. Whenever there was a strike, they went beyond the usual limit. When people went for broke, immediately their day-to-day life changed. People put their lives together because that community, communalizing, gave them more strength to confront the employer. And now it's given more women more strength to confront the state. I was mentioning the women who create communal forms of life are able to go to the municipal building and tell the authorities, bring water, bring electricity, bring this. In other words, to confront the state, you have to have a certain power. You have, unless you are engaged in struggle that what I call episodic. You fight against today and tomorrow everybody goes home. But we are talking about struggle that are building, that are constructive, that are not only saying no, but they construct at the same time as they are resisting they are also constructing something positive. I'm very interested in this construction, how the new society is constructed out of the struggles of today. So absolutely, you're right. You need to engage the state. Absolutely. This brings up also the other issue about the state, the question of anarchy. Well, the anarchist movement has its own history, has its own modality. You know, let's talk about democracy. Remember, the word democracy comes from the Greek, and it means power of the people. The power of the people. And in Greece, there was a period of democratic government when, in fact, power was exercised by people on a rotative basis. You know, that was their way of implementing self-government, that everybody periodically was involved in managing the power of the state, right? So the question of what are we talking about? We are talking about being able to make some decision about the basic things of our life. We know that today we don't do that. How do we do that? How do we do? The state that we know, the modern state, and you talk about the modern state is very, very, the state that we know in all its form has always been involved with the organization of exploitation of life, right? So this is where, when we talk about the state, we don't talk about a neutral organization. We're talking about, you know, so I'm very interested in, you know, about, for example, the experiment of the Zapatistas, right? So the Zapatistas have created a community in the mountain of Chiapas where they create communal forms of life outside of a state form. I think that that's a very interesting experiment, right? And they are continuously reimagining ways in which people can actually participate in the decision-making that affecting their life, economically, politically. I think that's what we're talking about. We are not talking about a power that dictates. We're talking about the ability, you know, this famous democracy that everybody talks about. What do we mean by it, right? So that's it. Then, yes, the question of an alternative knowledge. Absolutely. My brother, you're absolutely right. We need the counter knowledge. But I think the counter knowledge is being constructed. I think that this counter knowledge is being constructed, you know. I think, for example, that there's a tremendous, you know, set of knowledges, partially reappropriation of older forms. For instance, to give you an idea, I mean, I'm sure you know, because, but you know, today, agriculture depends on pesticides, fertilizers, and pesticides. And we know that pesticides, I mean, we know that they are producing cancers. We know that they're poisoning the water, poisoning the earth. But there were methods, you know, ancestral methods that were known to create forms of agriculture without pesticides by mixing plants in such a way that insects will not be interested in attacking corn, in attacking wheat, in attacking the plants that we need. So the insects were given their own herbs. They were given their own plants. These methods today are being rediscovered, reenacted in many parts of the American continent, and I'm sure in Africa. So there is a counter knowledge that, of course, is constantly produced by the struggle, but is also in part recuperation of forms of knowledge, that have been obliterated. So absolutely, you cannot have a new society, you cannot have new forms of organization without new forms of knowledge. Absolutely. This is very important. And last, the question of women's power, using the reproductive power. I mean, here I'm thinking, of course, of Lysistrata, right? The famous story of when Greek women decided to deny the men sexual relation unless they stopped war, right? I think you're hinting to something. Well, I think that the power of women today is expressed in a way, the fact that women are saying, no, I'm not going to reproduce. More and more women are saying, I'm not going to bring children into this world until you create a different kind of world. I'm not going to bring children in a world that is ravaged by war, where, you're condemning them to a life of poverty, to a life of anxiety, to a life of exclusion. And I think that we have to read the graphics. We have to read the fact in the decline of the birth rate, there is a struggle. There is a no saying. It's not just that the women don't have the means. Women are choosing that, and they're entering into a relation in which, and in fact, we already see that in the past, the capitalism, the capitalist state in France, in Italy, incentivized immigration precisely because of this constant collapse of the birth rate. Yeah. Today, of course, they are fighting against immigrants because immigrants did not accept to come to our countries, right, and be super exploited. But they actually came and organized, fought. In fact, in the United States, immigrant community have led many of the struggle, working class struggle, have created new union. And this is why, of course, today there is a rush to attack them, to deport them. But yeah, I think the women are expressing that power, and there is a no saying behind the collapse of the birth rate. Thank you.
This can come to the podium.
Thank you, Professor. In Post-Patriarchy, the essay, you said that in a post-patriarchal, post-capitalist world, there'll be an expansion of the work that's expected from us. And that's work that technology can't fix for the largest part. And I just wanted to ask if that also includes reconfiguration of what we call work. And what I mean to ask is, do you think that the academy has a place in a post-patriarchal, post-capitalist world? Okay.
Well,
one second,
unfortunately,
we
sure,
collect
okay.
We collect 3.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Federici, for this fascinating lecture. Mine is a very short question. I just need clarification, that's all. If I heard you correctly, you said patriarchy has been a trans-historical phenomenon. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Do you think in other words, do you think patriarchy is historical, or does it involve some sort of trans-historical aspect to it? Thank you.
Hello. I also have a very brief question. You mentioned, or you asked a question regarding democracy. What does democracy look like? and you mentioned how it was practiced back in Greece. And I'm just wondering, what do you think of alternative governing systems like plutocracy or a sortition, where elected officials are selected by lot rather than potentially? And I was really curious to hear what you think about that. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so the question of academy, I have to say that academy has become so commercial. It's become so, I mean, we are witnessing such a crisis in the academic world. And the academic world, as we have seen it, has become a place, where companies can conduct tests, can conduct their laboratory research. Has become a place where the military, so I think we need to figure out what kind of academy. We're not talking about Plato's Academy, right? Maybe Plato's Academy, although Plato's Academy, of course, was in a world that coexisted with slavery, right? So I say that places in which knowledge is collectively created and collectively practiced, of course, they're part of, has to be, right? But the academy in our present form has become so degraded, and we're witnessing it today constantly, has become so degraded that I would say that is not a model of how knowledge is produced and distributed. At the same time, I would say to those who say, well, forget about the academy, yeah, it's useless. The academy is still a place of struggle. The academic world is made possible by the work of many, many people. And we cannot just simply say, well, the academy is like a factory. The struggle continues there too. I raised that issue because, and here I want to make a shout to Alamin Mazrui. When we did the committee, the bulletin for the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa, and sometime a criticism we would hear was, oh, why you bother with the academy? It's a place of privilege, particularly in Africa. And we'll say, no, the academy is a place of struggle, of course. We have to find ways to break down the walls. As you break down the walls of the nuclear family, we break down the walls that separate the academy as a place of privilege from the community at large. By transhistorical, I meant that, we found patriarchy throughout history, but it's true, not throughout all history. We also have documentation of matriarchal society, of societies, where you had the feminist principle prevailed. I was recently in Greece, and as usual, I always go back to, the museums, etc. And you can see, for instance, in the history of Greece BC, a change from a basically matricentric, social world to one that becomes patriarchal, and this is reflected in sculpture, this is reflected, in painting, this is reflected above all in literature, like Euripides' Oresteia reflects the moment in which these positive female figures, the Furies, become negative, right? And Oresteia is built on the right of the man to kill the mother, so there is, but transhistorian, the patriarchy is not only, it has traversed several historical periods. And the plutocracy, I think I lost the meaning of the last word. Can you repeat the last question?
As I understood it, if you could comment on other form of decision making that are not necessarily
Yes.
based on Greek
Oh,
democracy.
yes, the lot, yes. Yeah, that was an interesting one, right? Yes, the people drew. So we are talking about Greece, and we are talking about a phase in its democratic government in which those who would govern would be selected by drawing lots. There was a program recently on American TV that basically showed how in Greece they have reconstructed that process, the kind of instrument that they used to sort out the lots. The lots was something that, you picked. Those who picked certain lots, certain little pieces of stone, would be those who for 1 year ran the government. I don't know. I don't know. Certainly, it was better than a dictatorial system. At the same time, I think I would prefer something that has more input from the community at large. I could think of other system that is not that, where, for example, you have, to give you an idea, okay, this is perhaps is not appropriate, but during my visit to Greece this summer, I visited a refugee camp in Athens, a big squat, 500 people, built by 16 years ago by refugees from Kurdistan, then from Africa, then from Greece. And they have created not only a big squad, a community, but they have made an effort. It's called Prosfigika and has been under attack by the government. They have made an effort to create a self-governed community. And what they have done, they have analyzed the different form of power relation and figured out what kind of structure they needed to have in order to deal with that. So there is the women's structure, the women's assembly, the women's space. So the women can deal with their issue, their problem, deal with patriarchal relation within the community. There is the children's structure. They try to figure out what is the children need. So the children are not being simply manipulated, but have their own dignity recognized, right? So I was very impressed by this work. And when I'm thinking of a future society, of course, on a much broader scale, I'm thinking of that definitely. I think that drawing the lots is not enough, particularly when we come from society where racial, gender, and division hierarchies are so deep. We need to deal with that, and we need to create structure, input, coming, and subverting those divisions, those hierarchies. This is the task. This is the challenge. We are all called to respond to this.
We're almost finished. I'd like to express my comments. It's between a comment and a question. So
sure.
On your idea of the commons, so I understand and appreciate that it's generated by particular experiences, but it seems to have also a programmatic character. And in that sense, retain some form of formalism that you cannot specify in advance what it is.
Yeah.
And you say we do it in the struggle, like the Zapatistas, lo vemos andando, right? We see it on the way, right? Now, I agree with you that it's a necessary condition. Now, doing things together, is it sufficient? What I mean by that, if we take into account what you said and what is in everybody, under everybody's eyes, that protracted violence for such a long time as a fact in the way in which people internalize violence and leave social relationships. And so the fact of shifting to a communal way of living might not necessarily lead to a healing of that violence by the very fact of living together. And so what are some of the things that has to be done on the way? Because it makes me think, why, what you raise as a question, why men don't go and organize themselves and protest? Is a matter of necessity, that they are forced to do it and they will have to do it. Is a matter of cultural change. What sort of things that might have to be? We have to think on the way as we go to the common, or already as part of the common in certain way. It's more of a comment than a question. It's up to you if you want to react.
I think there are two factors involved, right? I think there are two factors involved. And this, I want to give priority to one. I think that you're absolutely right. You know, I mean, look at the society. So I'm looking, for example, now at the United States, right? And I'm thinking that, roughly speaking, all this is very rough, but roughly speaking, you can think of people who understand really the need for bottom-up social change. They understand that this capitalist system is not providing for life, right? Then you have a lot of people, there's another, let's say 30%, I don't know, and who are now, for example, going or have been going in the direction of the right. And this is true in Europe, not because their real interest is with the right, but because they've been disappointed by the center-left politics, the institutional left, or what they call the institutional center. And they don't know, they don't have the ability to think of an alternative beyond shifting. It's like the pendulum, right? And this poses a real big problem. How do we relate? For example, I think it's very clear that when we think of the Trump administration, that what is new is the way certain policies that in the past, were hidden, now are embraced openly. But the policies that the Trump administration is implementing have been prepared step by step by step by the government that came before, including Obama, the Obama government. So, the disappointment of large people, and that's why we have to really there is, of course, another part of the country who, you can say, has been so dehumanized. And we have to understand the dehumanization process, and this, of course, is the real difficulty. People have become so dehumanized, they can, in fact, destroy massively human life, engage in the most cruel form without feeling anything. And I think the increase in militarization, this is why a movement. So, for example, there are forms of struggle that are necessary, and to the militarization of life, and to war, anti-war movement, fundamental, to end the destruction of life, and to end the widespread of dehumanization. Many of the crimes that are committed, including by policemen, in the United States now, all by people are coming back, or coming back from this war, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, destroyed, maddened, completely desensitized to the cruelty of what they're doing. And so, yeah, there's a tremendous process of regeneration, but engaging in violence, it's not, also we have to understand what is violence. For example, the politics of the IMF are violent politics. Every time, for example, you decide that, this currency has to be completely devalued, and, or that, investment in healthcare has to be, cut, you're condemning people to die. So I want to, there is also a whole issue about but certainly when we are thinking of commoning, we are also thinking broadly of, and when we talk about placing life at the center, we're talking about constructive and alternative vision of what life could be. An alternative vision against a danger that we're all experiencing, the danger of dehumanization, which is a danger with not only those who are committed to slavery, those who are committed to war, you know, are destined to, but we are all in danger of it, because the exposure to constant violence, you know, is creating a sense of almost normalization. You know, I think what is happening today is very dangerous. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
You have addressed it for sure. Thank you so very much. Thank you for your time, for your care for us, especially because you have also commitment to care. Join me in.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to you. Yes, yes. Oh, and thank you to all the beautiful, yes, that are coming. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate it.
Bye. See. Bye.
The tea is outside.
Bye.
It's not for our traditions.
See.